The following teaching is by Jim Pugh through the ministry of God is Government. If you have never listened to one of our Bridge of Truth podcasts and wish to see all the topics taught through this Bridge of Truth ministry, please go to www.godisgovernment.com to find the inventory of Bridge of Truth podcasts. Now welcome Jim Pugh as he presents another historical study of truth from history, Bible scripture, or current events.
The Serpent's Egg, World War I. We have got to the point in history that the condition of the world was changed by the war to end all wars. General Douglas MacArthur stated that, "I am concerned for the security of our great nation, not so much because of any threat from without, but because of the insidious forces working from within." Andrew Carnegie, Wealth Speech in 1889, stated, "Men of wealth should form a synthetic free enterprise system based on cradle-to-grave schooling. The people who advance through schooling will be given licenses to lead profitable lives. All licenses will be tied to forms of schooling. This way, the entire economy can be controlled, and people will have a motivation to learn what you want them to learn. It also places the minds of all children in the hands of a few social engineers." Within the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace's plan to create a world without war, a serpent's egg had been planted. This came to light in 1964 when the research staff of the Reese Commission, a congressional committee set up to probe tax-exempt foundations, came upon the minutes of a meeting of the CEIP trustees in 1911, which was held to discuss the question, "Is there any means known to man more effective than was to alter the life of an entire people?" The trustees concluded that only war could serve to see the stage for world government. At the end of the meeting, they resolved to influence the diplomatic machinery toward launching a world conflagration by gaining control of the U.S. State Department. Their resolution produced profound results. Root gained the position as the American delegate to the Hague Tribunal. Shotwell came to write the Social Security clauses of the Versailles Treaty. Brookings received the appointment to chair the War Industries Board and the Price Fixing Committee. Foster became a fixture in the office of Robert Lansing, Wilson's Secretary of State, who by a happy stroke of coincidence happened to be Foster's son-in-law. Eliot, an avowed pacifist, wrote articles about the necessity of supporting the Allied forces for major U.S. newspapers. Choate embarked on a speaking tour to promote American involvement in the European conflict. And Dodge, who commenced to sell millions in munitions to the Allies, emerged as Wilson's financier. While all of this is happening, we find that the rise of the Round Table in London is taking place. The brokers were on the move in Great Britain as well. As soon as the Great War broke out, members of the Round Table began to dine every Monday night at the residence of Leopold Amory, who had been recruited to join the group while serving as a correspondent for the London Times during the Boer War. The Monday night diners included Lord Milner, Philip Kerr, known as Lord Lothian, Lord Robert Brand, Reginald Brett, known as Lord Esher, Geoffrey Dawson, Lord Waldorf Astor, Baron John Buchan, and Sir Leander Jameson of the infamous Jameson Raid. By producing a flow of leaks to the British press, they managed to obtain Herbert Henry Asquith's ouster as Britain's Prime Minister. In his place, they arranged the appointment of David Lloyd George, an adjunct member of the secret society that Cecil Rhodes had created. As soon as Lloyd George assumed occupancy of 10 Downing Street, Milner became Secretary of War, Philip Kerr became Lloyd George's personal secretary, Leopold Amory became Assistant Secretary to the War Cabinet, Waldorf Astor became Lloyd George's Parliamentary Secretary, Robert Brand became Deputy Chairman of the British Mission in Washington, D.C., John Buchan became Lloyd George's Director of Intelligence, and Reginald Brett became the de facto head of the British Intelligence Service. The British Empire was now firmly in the hands of a cabal intent upon making the dream of Cecil Rhodes a political reality. Back home in the good old USA and prior to 1917, the United States remained as isolationist nation that stayed clear from all foreign entanglements. This was in keeping with the advice of George Washington, who said in his farewell address, "The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is in extending our commercial relations to have with them as little political connections as possible. So far as we have already formed engagements, let them be fulfilled with perfect good faith." Here let us stop. Europe has a set of primary interests which to us have none, or a very remote relation. Hence she must be engaged in frequent controversies, the causes of which are essentially foreign to our concerns. Hence, therefore, it must be unwise in us to implicate ourselves by artificial ties in the ordinary vicissitudes of her politics, or the ordinary combination and collisions of her friendships or enmities. Similarly, Thomas Jefferson, in his inaugural address, pledged peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. This tradition of isolationism was fortified by the millions of immigrants who came to America to escape from oppression. During the 1800s, the United States spanned North America without departing from its source of isolationism. It fought the War of 1812, the Mexican War, and the Spanish-American War without forming foreign alliances or fighting on European soil. But with Wilson in the White House, America's money trust gained control of the Oval Office, thanks to Edward Mandell House, the president's closest friend and advisor. House, an ardent Anglophile who had been educated in England, was credited with swinging the 1912 Democratic Convention in Baltimore behind Wilson's nomination. He became Woodrow Wilson's constant companion from that point onwards, with his own suite of rooms in the White House. He was also in direct, sometimes daily contact with J.P. Morgan Jr., Jacob Schiff, Paul Warburg, and Democratic senators who sponsored the Federal Reserve's bill. House guided Wilson in every aspect of foreign and domestic policy, chose his cabinet, and established the first policies of his new administration. The interest between Carnegie and the House of Morgan became intertwined when Carnegie became one of the co-signers of a $500 million loan from J.P. Morgan and Company to the Anglo-French Financial Commission in 1914. The $500 million was to fund the Allied war against Germany, represented the largest foreign loan in Wall Street history. It was 5 times greater than the previous record holder, the $100 million loan to Great Britain for the Boer War. With such a tremendous amount at stake, it was essential to tip the scales in favor of the Allies by securing the participation of the United States in the conflict. In order to do that and sell the American people, an incident had to be manufactured that would provoke the American people to abandon their stance of isolationism and to enter the fracas. It came with the sinking of the Lusitania as a staged attack by a German submarine on May 7th, 1913. 1,198 civilians, including 128 Americans, died when the ship went down, and the seemingly unprovoked act of aggression against a passenger ocean liner served to arouse anti-German sentiment throughout the country. Many of the 767 survivors popped up and down in the ocean waves for 3 hours while seagulls swooped from the sky to peck out the eyes of the floating corpses. Few Americans realized that the sinking and delayed rescue had been planned by Winston Churchill and members of the British Admiralty, who were acting in tandem with Britain's Board of Trade, Colonel Edward M. House of the Wilson administration, and American industrialists, including J.P. Morgan, who had provided massive loans to Great Britain and the Allied forces. The American public was not informed that the Lusitania was transporting 6 million rounds of ammunition and other military munitions to Britain. Under the order of President Wilson, the ship's original manifest was hidden away in the archives of the Treasury Department, nor were they made aware that Churchill and other members of the Admiralty had directed the Lusitania to proceed at considerably reduced speed and without escort to the precise location within Irish Sea, where the German U-boat was laying in wait. And the public, for the most part, remained oblivious that the Germans had placed large ads in the New York newspaper to dissuade Americans from boarding the ocean liner. Many of you thought fake news is of current time. This would be false. Fake news has been around since 1871. We see, after the sinking of the Lusitania, stories about German atrocities began to capture headlines in U.S. newspapers, including the New York Times. One story reported that German soldiers were deliberately mutilating Belgian babies by cutting off their hands, in some cases even eating them. Another atrocity story involved a Canadian soldier who had supposedly been crucified with bayonets by the Germans. Many Canadians claimed to have witnessed the event, yet they all provided different versions of how it had happened. The Canadian High Command investigated the matter, concluding that it was untrue. Other reports circulated of Belgian women, often nuns, who had their breasts cut off by the Germans. A story appeared in the Times about German corpse factories where bodies of German soldiers were supposedly turned into glycerin for weapons or food for hogs. The stories produced moral outrage throughout America and a hatred for the bloodthirsty Hun. Few realized that the news came from Milner's Round Table and was circulated by J.P. Morgan, Jr., who had gained control of America's newspapers. On February 9, 1917, Congressman Oscar Callaway inserted this statement within the congressional record about Morgan's ability to control and manipulate the natural news. In March 1915, the J.P. Morgan interests, the steel, shipbuilding, and powder interests, and their subsidiary organizations got together 12 men high up in the newspaper world and employed them to select the most influential newspapers in the United States, and sufficient number of them to control generally the policy of the daily press in the United States. These 12 men worked the problems out by selecting 179 newspapers, and then began, by an elimination process, to retain only those necessary for the purpose of controlling the general policy of the daily press throughout the country. They found it was only necessary to purchase the control of 25 of the greatest papers. The 25 papers were agreed upon. Emissaries were sent to purchase the policy, national and international, of these papers. An agreement was reached. The policy of the papers was bought to be paid for by the month. An editor was furnished for each paper to properly supervise and edit information regarding the questions of preparedness, militarism, financial policies, and other things of national and international nature considered vital to the interests of the purchasers. This contract is in existence at the present time, and it accounts for the news columns of the daily press of the country being filled with all sorts of preparedness arguments and misrepresentations as to the present condition of the United States Army and Navy, and the possibility of the United States being attacked by foreign foes. This policy also included the suppression and opposition to the wishes of the interests served. The effectiveness of this scheme has been conclusively demonstrated by the character of the stuff carried in the daily press throughout the country since March 1915. They have resorted in anything necessary to commercialize public sentiment and sandbag the National Congress into making extravagant and wasteful appropriates for the Army and Navy under false pretense that it was necessary. Their stock argument is that it is patriotism. They are playing on every prejudice and passion of the American people. In the post-war years, investigations in Britain and France revealed that these stories were false and had been generated to increase popular support for America's entry into World War I. So we need to ask ourselves if the war was for the interests of the elite, cabal, Rothschild's control. What was the true war about? With the media in the control of Morgan, and in turn Rothschild, the American people never really knew the reason the doughboys were being dispatched to the trenches of France. They had been informed by leading journalists, including Roundtable member Walter Lippmann, that the cause of the war was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, by a Serbian nationalist on June 28, 1914. The murder, most Americans were led to believe, prompted conflict between Russia, Serbia's ally, and Germany, the Austro-Hungarian protector. They were shielded from the fact that the war, like all wars, had been sparked by economic interests and that the conflict had been in the works for decades. The creation of the German Empire under Bismarck upset the balance of powers that had existed in Europe for more than 2 centuries. England ruled supreme over the continent until 1871. This supremacy had been repeatedly challenged by Spain and by France, but England always remained victorious. The fact that Germany now grew stronger by acquiring colonies in Africa and by building up its military force was a severe threat to the economic hegemony of England. To counteract the rise of Germany, the international bankers, who at that time were excluded from the economic development in Germany, sought for ways to limit and control Germany. Between 1894 and 1907, a number of international treaties were signed to have Russia, France, England, and other nations unite against Germany in the case of war. It was the task of the so-called Committee of 300 at the Round Table, which later became known as Chatham House, to set the stage for World War. Members of the committee included Lord Albert Grey, Lord Arnold Toynbee, Lord Alfred Milner, and H.J. Mackinder, who became known as the father of geopolitics. Edward Bernays, the so-called father of public relations, and Walter Lippmann, the founding editor of the New Republic, were the American specialists of the committee. Lord Rothermere, aka Harold Harmsworth, used his newspaper, the Daily Mail, as a tool to try out their social conditioning techniques on his readers. After a test period of 6 months, they had found that 87% of the public had formed opinions without rational or critical thought processes. Thereupon, the English working class became subjected to a constant onslaught of propaganda, designed to convince them that they were obliged to send their sons by the millions to their deaths. The experiment verified that human beings can be conditioned as easily as rats.
The following teaching is by Jim Pugh through the Ministry of God as Government. If you have never listened to one of our Bridge of Truth podcasts and wish to see all the topics taught through this Bridge of Truth ministry, please go to www.godisgovernment.com to find the inventory of Bridge of Truth podcasts. Now welcome Jim Pugh as he presents another historical study of truth from history, Bible scripture, or current events.
Taking over the control of the world. Aristotle once stated that money, being naturally barren, to make it breed money is preposterous and a perversion for the end of its institution, which was only to serve the purpose of exchange and not of increase. Men called bankers we shall hate, for they enrich themselves while doing nothing. The so-called Aldrich plan, which had been devised at Jekyll Island, called for the creation of a massive banking octopus, the National Reserve Association, NRA. The central bank of the association would be capitalized with a minimum of $100 million, and 15 branches would be set up throughout the country, USA. The branches were to be controlled by member banks on the basis of their financial holdings. That is, banks that were owned or controlled by the money trust. The NRA would issue currency that would be the property of the bank and would hold the deposits of the federal government. For this reason, The power of the association would increase in proportion to the size of the government. Bankers and businessmen from each of the 15 financial districts would elect 30 out of 39 members of the NRA board. This process would ensure that the system would be self-perpetuating. Aldrich's name on the plan was problematic. As Liaquat Ahmed explains in Laws of Finance, Nelson Aldrich may have been the most knowledgeable member of the Senate about finance, but the cause of central banking in the United States could not have found a worse champion. In a Senate full of very rich men, it was becoming known as the Millionaires Club. He was one of the richest, having sold his stake in the United Traction and Electric Company of Rhode Island for $10 million. He boasted a grand estate in Newport, Rhode Island, and his daughter Abby had married John D. Rockefeller Jr. He was a fervent supporter of big business, a bitter enemy of regulation, an advocate of high tariffs. Rumors abounded, furthermore, that he traded political favors for financial contributions. In short, he was the living embodiment of everything that opponents of a central bank most feared. The surprise came when the plan met with fierce opposition. Charles A. Lindbergh, a Republican from Minnesota, father of the famous aviator, described the proposed legislation as an attempt by a handful of unscrupulous bankers to gain unlimited power. In a speech before Congress on June 13, 1911, he said, Wall Street, backed by Morgan, Rockefeller, and others, would control the Reserve Association, and those again, backed by all the deposits of the national banks holding the private funds of the people, which is provided in the Aldrich Plan, would be the most wonderful financial machinery that finite beings could invent to take control of the world. In response to Lindbergh's comments, Congress authorized the formation of a committee under the leadership of Arsen Pujo, a Democrat from Louisiana, to determine if a money trust had been created to gain control of the U.S. economy. The committee verified that a financial cartel had been established under J.P. Morgan, which controlled over $22 billion in revenue and 112 corporations. It further maintained that the Morgan cartel manipulated the daily transactions on the New York Stock Exchange. Republican President William Howard Taft also hastened the Congress's instantaneous rejection of the Aldrich Plan by vowing to veto the bill as soon as it arrived at his desk. The plan went down in flames even before it was brought to the floor for a vote. And Taft, by making the vow, had unwittingly secured his own political demise. In all of this, the money trust remained undeterred by the setback. To ensure the defeat of Taft in the 1912 election, Morgan provided the funding for former President Theodore Roosevelt to run as a candidate for the newly created Progressive Bull Moose Party. Morgan also dispatched two of his most trusted agents, banker George Perkins and publisher Frank Munsey, to accompany Roosevelt throughout the campaign. The two men helped with the speeches, drummed up large crowds, and provided the feisty candidate with a steady supply of cash. For the Democratic candidate, the trust opted for Woodrow Wilson, an austere, scholarly figure who lived his life in the shadow of Wall Street. He was close to Andrew Carnegie, shared Carnegie's ideology, and became a trustee of the Carnegie Foundation. As president of Princeton University, his salary was augmented by a yearly stipend from Cleveland Dodge and Cyrus McCormick, directors of Rockefeller's National City Bank. In the midst of the panic of 1907, Wilson said that the country should be guided by a panel of financial experts with J.P. Morgan as chairman. Wall Street cabal could not have found a more submissive candidate. In 1912, Wilson was brought by prominent banker Bernard Baruch like a poodle on a string to Democratic headquarters in New York, where Wilson agreed, if elected president, to support a revision of the Aldrich Plan, to advocate a graduated income tax, and to seek the approval of Wall Street for appointees to his cabinet. Following the meeting, Wilson received financial backing for his presidential campaign from Baruch Cleveland Dodge and Jachin Schiff of Kuhn Loeb. The selection of the bespectacled academician was a masterful subterfuge. It seemed inconceivable that any Wall Street banker would support a Democrat, especially when the party platform contained this plank. We oppose the so-called Aldrich bill, or the establishment of a central bank, and what is known as the money trust. The election went precisely as planned. Wilson won with only 42% of the popular vote. Had Roosevelt not entered the race, most of his votes undoubtedly would have gone to Taft, and Wilson's place in American history would consist of a footnote. With Wilson in the White House, the Aldrich bill was repackaged and reintroduced as the Glass Act, named for Senator Cart Glass, who had been an opponent of the Aldrich bill. In order to convince the public and Congress that the new legislation was really a people's bill, central bankers, including Frank Vanderlip, denounced it, and Senator Aldrich refused to support it. Years later, Vanderlip wrote in his memoirs, "Now, although the Aldrich Federal Reserve Plan was defeated when it bore the name Aldrich, nevertheless, its essential points were all contained in the plan that was finally adopted." On December 22, 1913, the Federal Reserve Act became law. The House vote was 298 to 60, the Senate 43 to 25. Upon its approval, Congressman Lindbergh, one of the few who realized the bell was now trolling for Uncle Sam, said, "This act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When the president signs this act, the invisible government by the money power, proven to exist by the money trust investigation, will be legalized. The money power overawes the legislative and execute forces of the nation and of the states. I have seen these forces exerted during the different stages of this bill. The new law will create inflation whenever the trusts want inflation. It may not do so immediately, but the trusts want a period of inflation because all the stocks they hold have gone down. Now, if the trusts can get another period of inflation, they figure they can unload the stocks on the people at high prices during the excitement and then living on a panic and put them back at low prices. The people may not know it immediately, but the day of reckoning is only a few years removed. The Federal Reserve began operations on November 16, 1914, with a capital base of $143 million. The money came from the sale of shares in the 12 district banks. The payments to the Federal Reserve Board of Governors in Washington, D.C. arrived in the form of gold bullion. Each district bank of the Fed was a separate tax-exempt corporation with 9 directors from its region's banking and business community. The shares, in accordance with Section 7 of the Federal Reserve Act, were all owned by private banks and individuals who received yearly dividends in the amount of 6% of the net revenue. The remaining revenue was transferred to the Board of Governors as a franchise fee. This money was used by the governors to supplement the gold reserves, since gold remained the sole standard of the nation's currency. A partial listing of the 1914 principal shareholders in the Fed's district banks contains the names of N. M. Rothschild, London; Lord Montague Norman, London; Brown, Shipley and Company, London; Alex Brown and Sons, Baltimore; Brown Brothers, Harriman, New York; Morgan at Sea, Paris; Morgan, Grenfell and Company, London; J.P. Morgan Company, New York; Morgan Guarantee Company, New York; Morgan Stanley Company, New York; Lazard Brothers, New York; J. Henry Schroeder Banking Corporation, New York; Schroeder Bank, Hamburg, New York, and Montgomery, Alabama; Lehman Stern, New Orleans; Drexel and Company, Philadelphia; National City Bank, New York; William Rockefeller; J.P. Morgan, Percy Rockefeller, New York Trust, New York Edison, Sherman and Sterling; National Bank of Commerce, later identified as Morgan Guaranty Trust Company, New York Equitable Life, J.P. Morgan, H.P. Davison, J.P. Morgan, North British Mercantile Insurance, London, Levi P. Morgan, New York, First National Bank of New York, Goldman Sachs Bank of New York, Israel Moses Saif Bank of Italy, Royal Bank of Scotland, Bank of Nova Scotia, First National Bank of Boston, First National Bank of Cincinnati, Philadelphia National Bank, First National Bank of Minneapolis, First National Bank of Kansas City, and the American Foreign Banking Corporation, New York. The largest shareholder was the Rockefeller, controlled by National City Bank with 30,000 shares. The second largest was the Morgan-controlled First National Bank with 15,000 shares. The fact that foreign banks purchased substantial shares in the Federal Reserve System ensured that the economic course of the United States no longer would be controlled and directed solely by representatives of the American people or duly appointed officials of the Treasury Department, but also by a clique of very wealthy bankers from London, Paris, Hamburg, Berlin, and Rome. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York quickly emerged as the fountainhead of the system, since Manhattan remained the financial capital of the nation. The other 11 banks, in the words of Frederick Lundberg, became so many expensive mausoleums erected to salve the local pride and quell the Jacksonian fears of the hinterland. These banks were set up in Boston, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Richmond, Atlanta, Chicago, St. Louis, Minneapolis, Kansas City, Dallas, and San Francisco. May 19, 1914, the organization chart of the New York Fed showed that of the 203,053 shares, Rockefeller's National City Bank purchased 30,000 shares, while the Morgan Baker First National Bank took 15,000 shares. The National Bank of Commerce, of which Paul Warburg was a principal shareholder, acquired 21,000 shares. Hanover Bank, with Lord Rothschild as a director, gained 10,200 shares. The Rockefeller-owned Chase National Bank took 6,000 shares, as did the Morgan-affiliated Chemical Bank. These 6 banks owned 40% of the stock in the New York Fed. Other shareholders, according to European trade specialist Gary Kaw, were the Rothschild Bank of London and Berlin, the Lazard Brothers Bank of Paris, the Warburg Bank of Hamburg and Amsterdam, the Israel Saif Bank of Italy, Lehman Brothers of New York, and Goldman Sachs of New York. Benjamin Strong, president of the Morgan Bankers Trust Company, served as the first governor of the New York Fed. Under Strong's leadership, the Federal Reserve of New York, unsuspected by the nations, became interlinked with the Bank of England and the Banque de France. It alone became authorized to receive massive deposits of gold from other central banks. By 1924, a massive vault, half the size of a football field, was built 86 feet beneath the Federal Reserve Bank on the corner of William and Nassau Street in Lower Manhattan. 3 years later, the vault contained 10% of the world's entire supply of monetary gold. By authorizing a central bank to control the country's money supply and the value of a dollar, Congress enabled government spending to skyrocket beyond all expectations. Politicians now could commit to projects that cost millions of dollars more than the existing revenue. The Fed, in turn, could purchase the excess debt by printing more paper money, thereby inflating the economy. States, seduced by the federal deep pockets but lacking any mechanism to manufacture debt, would become dependent on Washington, D.C. for revenue, thereby reversing the traditional relationship that existed between state and federal governments. And the taxpayers would bear the brunt of bloated governments, thanks to the enactment of a graduated income tax. Prior to 1913, there was no income tax in America, except for a period during the Civil War and the early years of Reconstruction. The federal government existed on other sources of revenue, including tariffs and excise taxes. Not being able to spend or borrow heavily, the federal government remained limited in its scope of operations. Moreover, in 1895, the U.S. Supreme Court, in the case of Pollock versus Farmers Loan Trust, ruled that the 2% income tax that President Grover Cleveland attempted to impose on the American people to be unconstitutional. Due to this ruling, a federal income tax could only be imposed by a constitutional amendment. The man who proposed this amendment to Congress was the same senator who advanced the plan for the Federal Reserve, Nelson Aldrich. The average John Doe who voted for the approval of the amendment fancied that the progressive tax would soak the rich. He was unaware that the rich could channel their wealth into their tax-exempt foundations, or that they would manufacture losses and expenses to lessen their earnings. 20 years after the passage of the Revenue Act of 1933, a congressional committee discovered that J.P. Morgan Jr., one of the richest men in the country, was not paying any income tax at all. The people had been duped.
You have been listening to Bridge of Truth, brought to you by biblical teacher and author Jim Pugh with God is Government. For free access to all of Jim Pugh's Bridge of Truth podcast, please go to www.godisgovernment.com. Distribution of the Bridge of Truth and all other teachings are available for worldwide distribution. Thank you for joining us in this broadcast of Bridge of Truth.